Hello, hello, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Pamela Wilson. I'm waiting to see if Bernie will pop in and join me here, but I do want to go ahead and get started. We had a technical delay this morning, and I want to make sure that we take care of you on time because you've already waited a little bit. So to introduce myself, I'm going to go over to my slides, and what I want to let you know is I welcome questions. We're going to be covering some interesting information. It's an approach to podcasting that you may not have heard before. And I welcome questions. I have the chat box open and I can see it on my screen. So if you have any questions at all, just drop them in there. And I see someone just gave me a thumbs up. I would also appreciate you saying hello in the chat because that lets me know that someone is listening and watching and my audio and video are working okay. So I'm going to go over to my slides and start with an introduction and we'll get into the material. And if I do see Bernie, I will bring him on and we'll talk to him as well. All right. My name is Pamela Wilson. As I mentioned, I founded my business in 1992, which means I'm celebrating 30 years of business this year. And oh, there's Bernie. Okay, great. Let me bring him on. And I'm going to go back to my camera just so I can say hello to Bernie. Let's see. Here we go. Hello. Let's
Hello.
see. Yes, I can hear you.
Confused at my microphone, but I will sort that out very quickly.
I can hear you, and I think we can all hear
Yeah.
you. So are you seeing me? Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to switch back over to my slides and keep going. And then Bernie, maybe I'll bring you on a little bit later when we get to questions. I know we've had to scramble and use some different tech than what we were counting on. So let me go back over to my slides. So I was saying that I've been in business for 30 years and it's been an interesting journey because I started with a completely offline business and I now have an online business which started in 2010. So that's 12 years old, which is very old in online business years. So, and I'm the author of 2 books. We're going to be talking about the first one today because the first book happened partly as the result of a podcast that I ran, and that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm also a keynote speaker. I'm the former executive vice president of educational content for Copy Blogger Media. And today, what I do is I coach people in mid-career to build profitable online businesses. And I do that at my website, pamelawilson.com. And you can also find me, as anyone who's here live knows now, on my YouTube channel, which is Pamela Wilson Coach. And I see Saskia's here. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm glad that I'm coming through loud and clear. So let's dig into the material. You may have thought, or you may know someone who has thought, I want to write a book. And that's how I was feeling back in 2015. I felt almost like a calling to write a book. I was working for Copy Blogger at that time, executive vice president of educational content, which was a very busy job. And at that time, this company was a leader in online education. So I had a lot on my plate. And I felt as though I had discovered some kind of secret in those years. I didn't feel like I was a writer, and yet I was writing content for this really well-known website that was about writing. It was about teaching writing to people. And here I was, someone who didn't consider myself a writer, but I had figured out a way to put together content marketing that was very easy to do, even if you were like me and you didn't consider yourself a writer. So I felt really driven that I needed to get this method into the form of a book so that other people could benefit from it. But at that time, I had never written anything longer than a blog post. I had no idea how to get a book produced or even written. It was such a large, long writing project, and I didn't know how to do it. But I wanted to learn because I saw it as something that I would be able to do more than once. So this is important. This is an important part of this mentorship podcast concept that we're going to be talking about today. And it's that I had a single important question that I wanted to understand better. And it was a question that was shared by other people. This is really important. That will be the unifying idea behind this kind of podcast. So what I wanted to do was not just a hobby. It wasn't a whim. It was something I was very serious about. And what I did is what we all do when we're serious about something and we want to learn it. We start talking to friends and seeing what we can do to get this figured out. So one of the friends that I talked to was a friend of mine who is here in Nashville, Tennessee, where I live, named Jeff Goins. And Jeff was a very respected best-selling author, and I just happened to know him. So I talked to Jeff on the phone, and I said, Jeff, do you know someone who could be my book coach? I just need someone who can answer my questions as I go through the process of writing my first book. So do you know anyone who would be willing to do that? And his answer changed my life. What he said to me was, well, I do know someone, and how about me? And I said, wait, what? So he volunteered to be my book coach. And that was the last thing I thought was going to happen. But he did have a condition. And his condition was that the coaching happen on a podcast. He said, if I'm going to coach you, I will coach you publicly so that others can benefit from the coaching. And I loved that idea. It just so happened the timing was good because Copyblogger at that time was beginning this podcast network. So I was able to pitch them this idea of adding this podcast to their network. And they were all for it. They knew me, they knew Jeff, and they knew that a lot of people in their audience aspired to write books. So that is how Zero to Book was born. And the podcast, I'll explain more about how it worked. The podcast ended a long time ago, but you can still find it at zerotobook.me. And I still, after all these years, get people telling me, I listened to your podcast. I listened to every single episode while I was writing my book. So it has made an impact. Let's put it that way. So one of the things to know about this type of podcast, this mentorship podcast, is this idea that it is based on a project that has a beginning and an end. And this made it possible for both Jeff and me to agree to do this podcast because both of us were very busy people. I was working, an average of 55 hours a week for Copyblogger. Plus, I wanted to write a book somehow. And then making a podcast about the process of writing a book when I had this huge job, I just didn't know how I was going to fit it in. But we made it very simple, and we agreed that it would have a beginning and an end. And Jeff also didn't really have spare time in his schedule to devote to this, but we made it a project. And when the podcasts last as long as the project lasts, it helps you to commit to it. And it helps you to get maybe people who would not commit to doing a long-term podcast to commit to doing it. And the great thing is the podcast content lives on forever. So all you really need for a mentorship podcast is a mentor. In my case, it was Jeff Goins, a learner. In my case, that was me, and a project, preferably a project that lots of people will be interested in and that lots of people may aspire to do. So you may have heard this podcast, and I would love to know in chat if you have heard of this. There was a podcast earlier this year called The Trojan Horse Affair. And for my friends who are tuning in from the UK, you probably are familiar with this news story. It involved a lot of political intrigue. People's lives were really changed. It was a very riveting story. It was a great topic for a podcast. But there was something that was happening below the surface of that podcast that I felt was really fascinating as well. And it was the story of one of the podcast hosts, Hamza Syed, who had a completely different professional training. He was trained to be a doctor, and he decided he wanted to get into journalism. So while he was reporting on this story, he was also being mentored by the journalist who was reporting the story with him. So that same dynamic of learner and mentor was happening in that podcast, and it was just a whole different layer of story that happened in the podcast, and it made it very interesting to listen to. So let's come back to Zero to Book. You and I don't have the budget for this elaborate podcast like the Trojan Horse Affair. So what can you do if you're interested in delivering this mentorship style podcast and keeping people's attention with it? Well, you want to start with a project, and a project idea that has a beginning and an end. And hopefully it is a topic that other people want to master as well. If you want to have listeners to your podcast, you want to think about that as well. So in my case, lots of people aspire to write books. That was pretty easy. You want to do that thinking yourself about, what is something that people really want to master that I could talk about that would be sort of universally appealing and it would attract listeners. In order for, and again, here's the reminder, you want it to be a topic that others want to master. And you also, when you think about the podcast in terms of a project that has a beginning and an end, the other thing to think about is that it's going to give it kind of a natural story arc. So a great story has a beginning and a middle and an end. And when your podcast also has a beginning and a middle and an end, it gives it that beautiful story arc that's just inherently interesting to listen to, rather than being, podcasts about the same topic over and over again. You've got this story arc that's a narrative arc that's kind of built into it. The second thing you need is a mentor. And it does help if you already know each other. Now, I didn't know Jeff Goins that well when we got together to do this podcast. I felt I knew him pretty well by the time we finished, but I did at least know him. I knew a little about his background and the kinds of questions I could ask him and all of that. So I do think it's helpful if you have some kind of relationship with the person who is going to be the mentor in the podcast. If there's a relationship between the mentor and the learner. And, if there's not a pre-existing relationship, of course, you can always spend some time getting to know each other before you start recording your podcast. Now, Jeff has his own podcast and he enjoys teaching and coaching. And I do think that helped a lot in this case. So when you're looking for a mentor, that would be something to look for, is somebody who does enjoy teaching and coaching, who is who can speak fluidly about their topic. So I used to tease Jeff. I used to say, it's like you have a wind-up key on your back, and all I have to do to wind you up is to show up with a good question, and you are off to the races, and you can just talk for 10, 15 minutes answering my question. He's a really smart guy, and he wouldn't know my questions in advance. I would show up with questions, and he would answer with quotes and excerpts from books and, these really rich and detailed answers. So he brought that to the table, and I think that helped a lot. Also, when you're looking for a mentor, it's easier to get them to agree if something is beneficial to them as well. So in Jeff's case, he was teaching and coaching people to write books on his website at that time. So for him to show up publicly and mentor me on this topic, it was a way to publicly sort of build authority for what he was doing commercially with his business. So it was beneficial to me, but also to him. And I think that's something to look for as well when you're looking for a mentor. Then when it comes to the learner, and this has to do with me in this case, you want to look for somebody who is unafraid to be seen as a beginner. And, this involves asking some questions that might feel a little bit embarrassing, but you're a beginner in the topic, so you have to be willing to be seen as a beginner. I mentioned Hamza Syed before, and the Trojan Horse Affair podcast. He had a degree in medicine and was very accomplished, but he wanted to become a journalist, and he had to be willing to be a complete beginner journalist. In my case, I had a business for myself. At that time, I'd been in business for myself for about 25 years. I had this very visible position as executive vice president at the company where I worked, which was a well-known company. But I was a complete beginner when it came to being an author. So in order for that learner role to be compelling, I had to be willing to show up as a beginner, because you have to be willing to ask the beginner questions that the listeners are likely struggling with as well. So you have to try to anticipate the questions that they are asking and make sure you ask those as part of this mentorship podcast process. So let's talk about process next. Actually, that's a good thing to go to. When you see the Zero to Book podcast in retrospect, it looks like we went into this with this big plan, and I would love to say we had a plan in advance, but we really didn't. When I look back now, I can see how it all worked out, but we did not outline the whole thing ahead of time. The reality is, though, the process of developing a book does sort of have stages, so that was helpful. When you're writing a book, you have to come up with an idea for the book. You write the first draft, and that has all sorts of things associated with it. You have to get the first draft edited, and then you have to finalize your book and format it, send it to the printer, promote it. So it has these built-in steps, and those stages don't change that much no matter what book you're writing. So that helped our process a lot. I would say that if the project you want to cover has natural stages, you can use those stages to inform the content of your podcast. But if you don't, then you might want to think about mapping the episodes to stages that you kind of think through. So sit down and map out maybe a loose outline for how your mentorship podcast could work, how you want the episodes to flow from one to the other. And hopefully your listener can tune in and follow along and maybe develop the same kind of project and get similar results. And if you can do this, your podcast will be very valuable and be very appreciated. Now, the other thing to think about is, again, you want to create that loose outline, but you want to stay sort of loose and flexible, because you don't know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen in advance. Sometimes things go sideways on the project, and you need to stay sort of loose and flexible. I really enjoy doing this kind of podcast, and the best thing that I got from it really, well, there were two things. First of all, I had this built-in audience that was very committed to my first book, Master Content Marketing, because they had followed along as I wrote the book. So they were built in and ready to read this book that they had heard about over all this time. So it's a great way to really get people involved ahead of a project, because they're seeing you develop it and they're sort of cheering you on, right? So that was a huge plus. I had this built-in audience that was interested before I even released the book. But the other huge bonus is that I followed the same process to write a second book after I wrote the first one. So 2 years later, I wrote another book, a companion book to Master Content Marketing called Master Content Strategy. And that process that I learned in the course of the mentorship podcast informed my second book. So it was a great experience for me. It was a great experience for my readers. And it was a very easy podcast to do, because honestly, if you find a good mentor, you really just have to, if you are the learner, you have to show up with good questions. If you are the mentor, you need to be willing to coach someone through the process and answer all their questions with a lot of generous content that will help them. So I would love to know, I think we have a small group today, but I would love to know if you have any questions. And I'm going to hang out. I'll see if I can bring Bernie back. And if not, I'm happy to just hang out and answer questions. This is where you can find me before I turn my camera back on. PamelaWilson.com is my website. There is an online business assessment on the homepage that you might be interested in taking. It takes just a few minutes, and it will help you to sort of see where you are in your online business right now. And for those who are here on YouTube, Pamela Wilson Coach is my YouTube channel. That's a good place to find me. And I'm going to turn my camera back on to answer any questions that might come up. And I'm super happy to answer anything you can think of about this podcast. Thank you for sticking with me. And I see Bernie is back again. So let's see if we can put him back on camera. Here we go. Hello.
There we go. Have you got me? I was still in Zoom before.
Okay.
Yeah. At this stage of the game, we think we would have learnt our lessons. But
okay.
So one of the things I was gonna ask is how. So one of the projects in our company is we have a book about diversity and inclusion, and we do a podcast already. And this, one of the reasons I asked you about this is because there's like this podcast over here, this book over here, and trying to match them together seems a no-brainer, but we've never managed to do it. And is it just we never managed? We just need to say we're going to devote the next few months to podcasting about the book to launch it, and then also the actual topic's pretty. I mean, everyone knows about diversity and inclusion, but I don't want to sound like we're lecturing our audience or spinning out too quickly. It might seem like we're talking about cars, and then we suddenly start talking about cheeseburgers, and only a few people will stick around because they like you. Does that make sense?
It does. So the question is how to promote the book using your podcast. Is that right?
I think it is. It's how I feel like that could be. It could be as simple as that, and I'm overthinking it. But we have all the components that you and Jeff had, and they don't seem to match up as beautifully. And I heard you say we didn't have a plan when we started, and that made me feel much better instantly. So maybe that's it.
Yeah, well, so the way this podcast works, the way this kind of podcast works is you actually develop a podcast around the project. And theoretically, you sort of develop it so that people can follow the process as you create the project. So if we could turn back time, we would have a podcast that would be about you getting that book written, right?
Yeah.
And then people would be involved in the process. And then you know for sure that the podcast is the same topic as the book because, people or it will attract people who are interested in the content in the book, right? So what you could do in the spirit of this podcast would be to potentially go into a company that needs help with diversity and inclusion. They need that work done in their business. And maybe you do a podcast about working with that company to improve their diversity and inclusion efforts. And you podcast that project, right? So you podcast that process. So rather than making it doesn't have to be about a book. You could bring in, I have my book. If I know I'm going to talk about the book, I always put it on my desk next to me. So you could always say, we're going to use this as a reference when we work with you on your diversity and inclusion efforts. And then that's a way to sort of get some subtle book promotion in. Does that make sense?
It does. Because there's people we could talk into doing that. And actually the whole project has been around for a few years now. And it, like the pandemic, as you can imagine, wasn't that it was a bad time to launch a book. It was just no one had the brain cells to take on doing that.
Yes.
So now, and we're just more confident as a team of people. So that would really help that too. And I could see how that could work. And I think there's do you remember it's about the same time you and Jeff did that. The guy from Gimlet Media, he started Gimlet Media, and he did the startup podcast, and he just podcasted out loud, which is one of the bravest things I've ever seen. Alan Bloomberg, is it? Is that?
I'm not sure. I know
Uh,
the project you're talking about, but I don't remember his name.
I always
Yeah,
forget it.
it
But
is. It's a great way to
that
get
was
people involved because people love behind the scenes information. So anytime you can show them behind the scenes, kind of the working gears of your business, it's very compelling content.
so. As you were doing that, and in lots of other things I've known you for, as you're kind of working out loud, as we say, what goes? What do you just go? I know enough now that I'm just going to do it, and if it breaks, it breaks, and we'll make another one, or like what goes through your head as you're, oh, shall I post this semi-ready thing online and hope it works? When you get to your level, Pamela, what happens?
Oh, that's so funny. Oh, I have a million bazillion questions always. I never lack for questions, which is one of the reasons I had a feeling this podcast would work because it was something I had never done before. Like I said in the presentation, I mean, I've done a lot in my career, but I'd never written a book. So I was a complete beginner when it came to books. So I had no lack of questions. It was more like I had to edit down my questions or else the podcast episodes were going to be too long. So yeah, nothing changes, actually.
Yeah.
When you get to my level, nothing changes. You still have a bazillion questions and lots of things you're learning.
And what happened? If you were doing that now, would you still launch a Facebook group, or would you launch a Facebook group, or would you use another platform, or would you just not do any of that at all?
So I didn't actually launch a Facebook group in association with the podcast. What I did was I created a place that people could read my chapters when they were in draft form. And they were just hidden pages on my website. So I called it the Book Factory, and I invited people to sign up, and by signing up, they could read my chapters when they were in draft form and leave me comments. And that was super helpful, actually, because I would post these chapters and people would say, this is great, or they would say, this part was confusing. I would love to have a little more detail about this. You know, they gave me feedback that then made it into the book. So it was super helpful.
And it's I feel like I know the answer to this already, but I'm going to ask it for the other people. Is it really important to have people reading your book and checking it in that have audience, like what would you call it, about pre-readers or something, to like feedback
beta readers, a lot of times
beta
they call
readers,
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that like something you should absolutely do, or?
I don't think there are any hard and fast rules, to be honest. In my case, it was super helpful because it was my first book. By the time I did my second book, I didn't have that. I felt confident just working with an editor, developing the content with one person. But for my first book, I found it really helpful to put it in front of people and get their feedback. And again, it was also a way to bring people into the project as I was building it, and just develop this interest in the project.
And with the podcast and everything like that, you said one of the good things about it is having a beginning and an end, and then you can like walk away from it. Because one of the things with a podcast is, can I do this every week for the next 5 years? So there's that group of people you assembled around the book and everything like that, and is that, did you feel the need to give them somewhere else to go after they've done that thing with you? Or is it, I put the book out, here we go, and then I'm going to add that to my body of work and then move on to the next thing? How did you feel about that, I suppose, is the question.
You know, I really wanted them to move to buying the book. That was my big goal. I didn't set this up. It was really a project that I did. So I didn't set it up as part of my overarching business strategy. I probably should have, but I did not. So the goal was to get them into the book once they finished the podcast. That was the big thing.
Yeah. And what, as you've been talking now today, and you're thinking back to what you did, is there anything you think, oh man, I could have done that, or I should have done that, or if I was doing that today, I don't know, I can't think of an example like, oh, when we did the book, we didn't have Tesla cars, and now we do. I don't know, like something that's available now that wasn't available then.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think I would change it that much, honestly. I would probably do what you just mentioned and figure out how to move people. I mean, the people who signed up for my book factory, I did move them to my email list, so they became a part of my email list. But I didn't have sort of a long-term business strategy for how we were going to continue to interact. I contacted those people when I had the follow-up book, which I also have right on my desk, Bernie. Right here. So when
I discovered that I didn't know you'd done that, and I
really,
and I typed in Pamela because you know, I mean, obviously I hang out every word you say, but I just sort of didn't look at Cosby Blogger for ages, and then I went to read the first book. I was like, oh my god, where did that come from? And actually it was, I wanted strategy more than content. So you know, maybe the universe was directing things to me in a way, but I was well impressed that showed up.
Thank you. Yeah, the interesting thing is I wrote the first book. The first book was about creating content, and the second book was more about what to do with your content once it was created. And it's also to help people who have a lot of content and who really want to kind of make the most of that content, repurpose it, figure out how to use it on various platforms and all of that. So it's really the companion book. You have to sort of have the first book and have mastered the concepts in the first book to be able to take full advantage of the second one.
There's a bit in that, I think it's in the first book, where you talk about idea capture, and you say about using Evernote and Trello. And I always remember walking through Paris by the river and listening to that bit. And wherever, because I've listened to that book more than once, is it 4 hours? It's really quite short to get through.
It is. It's 4 or 5 hours, the narration. And I've been accused of being a slow talker. So, you know, that is, you asked about new technology. And when it comes to the book, not so much the podcast, but when it comes to the book, there is a source now that didn't exist called Airtable. And that, it turns out, is a fantastic tool for managing your content and tagging it and knowing, you know, making your content searchable and all of that. So that is a fantastic tool for basically keeping your content idea library. It's a great place to track content.
That's one of those things that's never worked for me, but I know it's amazing. And you can do Kanban boards and stuff in it as well.
You have to kind of wrap your brain around it. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a learning curve. And the same with, do you ever use Notion?
I haven't used Notion. I sort of chose Airtable over Notion, but yeah, it's whatever tool feels good to you. But that kind of a tool that's sort of database, it's built around the concept of a database, is super powerful.
It is. I read. That's exactly the sort of, both of those things. I read how other people use that, and I've never quite got far enough into it, but they are. I love them. So the other thing I definitely wanted to talk about before we zoom is email, because that's my favourite thing on the face of the planet, and has worked. I think it's the most consistent thing that has. When I say success, I don't mean like, you know, launched my $1 million business. It's just I've been emailing people nonstop for 15 years, and it just is the constant. Obviously, that's important around building a book, but can you just spell out how important that is? Because in the journey.
Yeah. So the thing that is so important about email is almost every other place that you can gather an audience is not completely under your control. You don't sort of own that list of names the way you do on email. So think about places you can develop an audience. You could develop an audience on YouTube, where we are now. You could develop an audience. You could develop listeners to your podcast, for example. You could maybe develop an audience on one of the social platforms, LinkedIn or Facebook. But those platforms really own those names, right? They own the database that has the information that says that they're your followers, right? Instagram is another one. Email, though, if you can get them on your email list, you own that database. So it gives you a platform that is truly yours. And the other thing that's interesting is, email is kind of, it's at this point, email is like a traditional place to get information, right? And it feels very intimate because email is used both for commercial uses, but also personal. So you may have an email from a family member sitting right next to a commercial email. And there's this beautiful mix that you see in your inbox that isn't in other places. So it's a great way to kind of reach people in a place where they feel safe and they feel kind of good, right? They open their inbox and they're expecting not necessarily bad things unless they're not using spam filters. They're expecting good things. They're expecting a mix of interesting information. So that is a great place to meet people. I think, you log into Facebook or even Instagram these days and you don't know what you're going to see when you log in, where an inbox is a tiny bit more predictable. So I think that makes it interesting.
I hear, I think it's very hard, like people like us, to spam people nowadays because people have to opt in, and people send me emails, and if I don't want to open it, I don't want to open it. I don't feel, if you send me an email that's part of your marketing sequence, I don't feel offended because I know I opted in, and I know you're not going to send me. I know you're not going to trick me. People who get in my inbox aren't tricking me. So do you think we're still worried about spam? Do you think we confuse spam versus I signed up for that and I don't want to get that anymore?
I don't think so as much anymore, honestly. Like I said, most people have spam filters in place, so I don't think they're as worried about that anymore. Ooh, hello, camera. My camera's got a beauty filter on me and I'm all fuzzy. Let's see. There we go.
Yeah, that's it.
Just had to get its attention. So, I don't think people are as worried anymore, honestly. There are still some people who use email in a way that's not completely legit, in my opinion. I've been doing a lot of podcast interviews lately to talk about my program, which I haven't even mentioned here, the Offer Accelerator. And you can go to offeraccelerator.com if you want to learn more about that. But anyway, I have this program. I go on podcasts to talk about this program. And there are podcast hosts that put me on their email list. And all of a sudden I start getting, multiple emails a week from this person who I'm not really that interested in their content.
See, saying that is an amateur move because we always say to people, so when people sign up for an event, and it's a group, you'd only sign up for the event if you wanted to come to the event and were interested in the topic anyway. So it's an in-person thing, and then we put you on the email list, and then we say if you don't want to get this anymore, unsubscribe, and so it's part of the thing. But like if I came on your podcast and then you added me to your email list on a professional level, I'd be like, what a rookie move. So in terms of when you have a book, because I think we were in danger of doing this. You have a book which we spent time reading, and we have a listenership and we have an email list, but we don't have a book email list. And I wonder if what a weak word. Sorry. I'm pretty sure that we're going to launch a book and then try and promote it to our podcast and email audience, which is different from the I want to buy a book audience. Is that a valid concern?
I think you can get your I'm going to buy your book audience from these other audiences. And that's exactly why, that's one of the reasons the podcast worked so well. And it's one of the reasons I developed that book factory so that I could develop an audience of people who are interested in the book before it even existed. And I actually went to that audience and asked them to help me get the word out. So I had a group of people who were willing to help me promote. That was super helpful.
And were they on a zero to book email list, or were they on a big brand system email list, or were they on a Pamela Wilson email list?
They were a segment, right? They were a segment of my overall list. So there was a percentage of people in my larger list that were interested specifically in the book. So I would email them separately.
The other thing I want to ask you about, because I hear everyone saying this who has any type of product, is, so it's 12, is it 12 episodes?
No, I think there are I think it's more like 24 or something like that.
Because this has just popped in my head, so let me go with this. So around the time of the book, you said, I read this book called The 12-Week Year. And I remember you were on another podcast and you were saying, I've just got to get my act together. I keep on talking about this book. So I read this book called The 12-Week Year and I'm going to get done in 12 weeks. And that was it 2015? I always forget. It was that type of time.
I wrote it at the beginning of 2016. And then it was launched by October of 2016.
I read that book then, and we had a little meetup in our co-working space that didn't really work. And then two people from that meetup, me and Karen, decided to keep meeting. So every time since the launch of your book, every Monday, we've had a WHAM meeting from that 12-week year book.
Oh,
so
wow.
Like 7 years now. And we've done the 7. My son's just helping himself to a pair as we're live on YouTube. So every week we've done that 12-week year thing since.
Wow.
Which I've just read how long that is. So as you're going through I think there was the podcast, which was one thing, but then you had to keep promoting the book, and there's something about you keep promoting something and you get sick of it and you're worrying if other people do. But then I think you have to promote it way longer. You have to talk about it way more than you think you do in order to get it out, get people to hear it. Can you say a little bit about that? When you're tired of it, you still need to keep on going. You're not annoying people.
Yes.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, by the time you are really, really tired of hearing about the thing you're promoting, that's usually the point in time when people are just beginning to have awareness about it. So I always tell people, don't lose faith. I always tell people that marketing is like beating a drum. You just have to keep beating the drum. Just keep a steady background beat, talking about what you have available so that people can know that you even offer it. I mean, at any given time, people come into your world, and if you don't talk about what you have on offer for a long time, they may not even know you have it, right? So you just have to keep this steady background drumbeat of what you have on offer, whether it's a book or a product or a program, whatever it is, you just have to keep mentioning it.
So in that, as either, Pamela as you are now, or back then when it was Copy Blogger, is there so many moves you can do a year? Would you think, I'm going to launch a book and I'm going to launch a product this year. So I've got 2 things to do this year and I'm not going to talk about anything else. Is there only so much your audience can cope with at one time, or that you have the energy to cope with at one time?
Yeah, definitely.
Just break that down for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to prioritize your time, right? So I do think ahead. I use that 12-week year process to work out my quarters and my quarterly goals. So I set those ahead of time and then kind of break them down into weeks, just like that book recommends, the 12-week year. And I work like that, really a quarter at a time. I sort of have annual goals, but so much changes over the course of a year that I really focus on quarters. I work a quarter at a time and then break it down into weeks and break it down into days. So
would you go, I'm going to launch a book this quarter and I'm going to launch a program this quarter, and then if you really get to the book and the course would launch into an event or something. There's I never said this out loud, but I always feel you need to have something coming along in the head that all this is moving towards, and then you reset, and then Salesforce do that big, whatever it's called, Force Cloud or something.
Right.
And hundreds of thousands of people go to it. And I remember someone in London years ago saying we do CloudForce, I think it's called, and that's the main thing in the whole company, and everything breaks down from that. So our end goal is to get, we never said to buy Salesforce, but our end goal is to get as many people as we come to CloudForce, but everything else is launching to that. So the more people that come to that, the better it is. And then everyone's going to end up buying Salesforce and, obediently.
Right.
But CloudForce was the main event in what they were doing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing that I have right now, I don't have an event. I have a program that is always open. It's called the Offer Accelerator. And it's an evergreen program that is always open and ready to accept members. So everything I do is really, the idea is to get people to join that program. I just put your name on there for anyone who doesn't know your name. I just realized I had to click a button to put your name on there. So Bernie, there you are. Yes, I definitely am always thinking about how to get people into that program. And everything that I do is with that goal in mind, to get people to join that program. So some months, some quarters, the way we do that is different than how we do it in other quarters. But that's kind of the overarching goal.
So after all your experience, and that's that's like the newest thing you've done. What are you doing? Like how are you communicating that differently from things in the past? Because there's a lot of Pamela experience. So I imagine you sat down and worked out the best bits from is that like your greatest hits of all the things you've done in one course launch nowadays?
You mean the Offer Accelerator?
Yeah.
Not really, Bernie, to tell you the truth. So the Offer Accelerator helps people with one very specific thing. And the reason that I created it is that after all those years helping people in the copy blogger audience, I saw that people who were in mid-career, so people like you and me who have expertise that we've developed over the years, come into the online space and get this message that they needed to take that expertise and package it into something that costs $99 and then sell it at volume. Just develop a massive email list and sell that tiny offer to lots and lots of people. And if they managed to pull that off, they could make a good living. And I realized that that was really messed up. So I come from an offline business where I was always one of the most expensive people to bid on projects. And because of that, my business did really well. And people used to tell me, you're the more expensive vendor, but I'm going to work with you because it's clear to me that you know what you're doing. So I brought that to the online space. And when I saw people being told, no, just, create a value ladder and have a $17 product and then, move people up to this more expensive offer, I was just like, that is ridiculous. So what I teach people to do in the Offer Accelerator is to create a single high value offer that will generate from 10 to 20,000 US dollars in revenue every month. So this is not a $500 offer. This is more like a $5,000 offer or a $15,000 offer. And what I discovered is the process for creating an offer at that level is not that dramatically different than what you have to do to create a less expensive offer, but there are a few elements that you need to include. So it's not, I guess in the sense that I have 35 years of experience and I'm bringing all of that experience to the program. Yes, it's all the best of what the expertise I've developed over the years. But it's not like it's that much content. It's actually just the content you need to develop this kind of offer. And then it's also my eyes on everything you do. So I have weekly reviews where I can review people's projects. I have weekly coaching so people can show up and if they get stuck on something, they can get my guidance. So it's more like that. It's more I'm bringing myself to the table and guiding people with just the amount of curriculum that they need to get this offer created. And the goal is that by the end of 30 days, you are testing your offer idea. And by the end of 6 months, you have this one high value offer created and it's generating great revenue for your business and everything is kind of heading up. Does that make sense?
That does. I'm so sorry to accuse you of putting all the best bits in the cocktail blender and shaking them up and hoping that what comes out the other side works.
A lot of people do that, right? Yeah. So it's a valid question because a lot of people create signature programs that are just, they throw everything in there and sell it at a higher price. And I didn't want to do that because the people I'm helping are busy. They have really busy lives. They're typically juggling a lot of different things. And I don't think it's fair to just sort of throw a bunch of content at them and tell them they have to consume it all in order to make an impact. So I tried to really pare it down to the necessary parts.
So something, as I've seen that online, something I've been dying to ask you is, I feel like in London, in our co-working meetup world, there's a lot of people that were able in COVID, in lockdown, to just not, for good and bad reasons, not work and then devote their attention to more creative things, whether that's cooking or making dresses or artwork or starting a podcast. And now there's this whole creator economy thing. And did that, did your offer like dramatically, did you feel like a surge of energy around the conversation around your offer as a result of the COVID thing? Because there are more people trying to have a second wind or I'm trying not to say follow their passion, but you know what I mean.
Do you want to hear something funny, Bernie? So I started the program at the end of 2020. At the very end of 2020, I was, kind of putting it together and opening it up to my first members. And it wasn't really a response to COVID at all. It was, no matter when I developed it, I would have probably delivered it in the same way. Zoom and Zoom recordings. And it was because I have members all over the world. I serve people in the UK, in Australia, all over the US, Canada, lots of places. So I knew it was always going to be virtual, and it would have been virtual anytime I created it. But the funny thing is, funny / sad / ironic / I don't know what to think about it. I sell it at the end of 2020. I get an initial group of, I think I had 8 members. It's a small program. It's always been a small program, and it will always be a small program. I don't bring in more than 5 people a month because I give people a lot of attention. So, I had like 8 members to start at that time, and we had our first meeting. And our first meeting was on January 6th, 2021. And I don't know if that date means anything to you, but it was the date that we had an insurrection at the Capitol in the US. So my client strategy coach, my client success coach rather, who helps me in the program, is from Canada. So we have our first meeting, and it's the day that they're supposed to be certifying the results of the 2020 election. And this is all happening in Washington, D.C. I log into our first meeting. We have our first meeting. It goes great. We all introduce each other. We start digging into the program. It's wonderful. I get off the meeting, and I happen to look at the New York Times website, and I jump on Slack, and I said to my client success coach, so it seems to be that they did an insurrection at the Capitol of the U.S. during the time that we were in our meeting. So very weird timing, but that was actually something good that came out of that day because the program kicked off.
That must be carved in your mind forever now. Yes,
it really was. Just before the meeting started, I posted this photo like, oh, I'm so excited. This day is finally here. And my program is going to have its first meeting. And then I get off the first meeting and I was like, oh, I'm not going to be remembering this day because of the first meeting of my program. So
that's and then what are your hopes for that in the future? Is that something you see yourself doing for a long time now? Is that your Is that your cornerstone piece?
It is. I really think it is because it serves people so well. I've seen huge transformations from the people who go through this program. So it is what I'm focusing on now. I may write another book at some point in the future. I don't, discount that idea. I'm sure at some point another book will come along, but I really am focused on that program. I also do a little bit of corporate consulting on the side, which I don't typically talk about, but that's also something that happens in my business. So that's a cool thing as well. But as far as the online business, the Offer Accelerator is my big focus. I'm really proud of the program. It does a good job It doesn't give people too much to learn. It gives people a lot of support, and it helps them create an offer that helps them to earn the money that they deserve to earn. Because by the time you're in mid-career, you are not a beginner. You're not a newbie. You should be earning good money from your expertise.
Definitely. Where can we find that online, Pamela? Is that just PamelaWilson.com, or is that?
Yeah, so if people go to PamelaWilson.com, they will see my homepage. There's an assessment there. And in the upper right corner, there's a button for Offer Accelerator. So they can just click on that button. Or they can go to OfferAccelerator.com, and that will take them right to the page on my website that talks about it.
That's ace. And thank you firstly for being here in person, and then for the super pro switch from Zoom to YouTube. That was seamless. In all my years, I didn't even know you could this little back thing here. We're talking in now existed. So I definitely upped my tech expertise as a result of this. And thank you. I really enjoyed our dinner in Nashville as well. That was and that very huge trip just before COVID. I tell people the last person I had dinner with internationally was Pamela Wilson. So there we go.
I know, it was just before the world changed. Again. Yeah.
It was ace. Okay. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you very much. If you go to, we can put links in the down here, but can't we? And if you're in London, you're always welcome to come and join a London Bloggers Meetup. And thanks again for your time today, Pamela.
Great, Bernie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.